A lot has been said about the Ukrainian offensive. How is it going now? It's a couple of weeks into it. Have they gained much ground?
Yes, thanks for having me on, Kimberly. They've gained a significant amount of territory in the period since the counter-offensive started. Now, it started on the 29th of August, although conditions had been set prior to that with some strikes, strategic strikes in Crimea against an airfield and some logistical supply hubs and what have you. Since then, they announced the offensive on the 29th of August. They've been pushing from the Kherson area, targeting bridge crossings across the Dnipro River, so cutting off the supply lines of the Russians in that area on the western bank of the river. And they're slowly pushing forward at a realistic pace, and the Russians are conducting a controlled withdrawal from the area to come back probably onto the eastern bank of the Dnipro River. What we then saw in the second week of September is that the second front of the counteroffensive up in the north, around the Kharkiv area, where the Russians were controlling the main supply lines coming down from Belgorod down to the south, where the main fighting was taking place in Izium. So if we can move on to the next slide.
There we go.
So from around about the 8th and 9th of September, the Ukrainian forces started pushing away from Kharkiv, forcing the Russians back over into the border into Russia itself, cutting off those vital supply lines coming down from Belgorod to Izium, and pushing the Russian forces back to the Oskil River, which is a natural obstacle which is dividing the forces there. So they've taken a considerable amount of territory in what was really quite a fast pace of time, over two to 3 days. What we're seeing now is a more realistic pace of the counteroffensive taking place. The Ukrainians have managed to establish a small bridgehead onto the eastern bank of the Oskil River. And we're now seeing they've liberated Izium, which was a key town they needed to take. They're now pushing towards Lyman, which will open up a corridor, allowing them to push forward towards Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, which, of course, they lost to the Russians in July of this year.
Yeah. Let's talk about these referenda that we've been reporting on all day. They're being held in certain regions. How are they going about them?
Well, the referendum are taking place in the Kherson Oblast, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and the Luhansk Oblast. Obviously, Donetsk and Luhansk form up the Donbass region, which was the stated aim of President Putin to take and liberate those to be part of Russia because of the Russian people there. So the referendums are taking place, most likely being rushed forward in response to the counteroffensive, so the Russians can claim the territory before it's taken over by the Ukrainians. Now, what we're seeing happening in these areas is residents are being obstructed from leaving the areas. There are incentives for the citizens to pass on their personal details in exchange for humanitarian aid. And that's likely for the Russians to get their details for falsification of voting records. We're also seeing, or we're having reports within some of the regions of young children from the age of 13 to 17 have been able to vote as well. And we're seeing in Russia itself, polling stations are being set up by the Russian authorities in the areas where people were forcibly relocated as a result of the war from these controlled areas. And again, they're going to be able to vote, or they're being forced to vote in those areas, and highly likely that the results will be falsified in order to have this sham referendum and produce the results, which will most likely result in a vote to annex those territories into Russia properly. But the problem we have is, particularly in Zaporizhia and Donetsk, the Russians don't actually control all of those oblasts. There's still a lot of those areas that are under control by the Ukrainians. So if they're going to annex them, they're in the position where they're trying to control something which they don't actually have any presence in.